Dear students, in this session and also in the subsequent sessions, we will discuss the Neoclassical growth model, also known as the Solow model of growth. Remember this, an economic model is constructed to explain economic phenomena. So, a model of economic growth is supposed to explain what we observe in an economy, its growth rate, comparison of one economy with another economy, what determines the growth rate, what determines differences in growth rates. These are all observed. Some countries are rich, some countries are poor, some countries are growing fast, some countries are growing at a slow pace. These are some of the empirical observations. So, a model of economic growth is supposed to explain all these phenomena. The Harrow-Domer model cannot explain these because Harrow-Domer model is a model explaining the condition for steady state growth only. So, the model which explain modern growth or the modern growth theory is the Solow model, also known as the Neoclassical model of growth, and also endogenous growth models developed in the 80s and 90s as a further subsequent development of Solow model. So, before explaining the Solow model, we first consider a few facts about economic growth. A few facts about economic growth. These facts are supposed to be explained by a growth model. Now, David S. Landis the renowned economic historian, speaking in the American Economic Association in 1988, choose the title of his speech, The Fundamental Question of Economic Growth and Development. The title was, "Why are we so rich? Why are we so rich and they so poor?" The title of his speech was, "Why are we so rich and they so poor?" Is a fundamental question in economic growth and development. And this question was a preoccupation of economists for centuries. That is why the title of Adam Smith's book is an inquiry into the nature and consequences of wealth of nations. So, growth and development and the fundamental question, why are we so rich and they so poor, is a preoccupation of economists, beginning with the classical economists and the father of economics, Adam Smith. The modern examination of this question, that is the modern examination of why are we so rich and they so poor, dates to 1950s and publication of two papers by Solow of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The modern question of the crucial question in growth and development, why some countries are rich, why some countries are poor, is examined by Solow in the 1950s in two papers. And his theory helped to clarify the role of accumulation of physical capital, the role of accumulation of physical capital, and also the importance of technological progress as the driving force behind economic development. Accumulation of physical capital and also the importance of technological progress as ultimate driving force of sustained economic growth. In the 60s and also 70s, work on economic growth flourished, but the theoretical explanation of technical change was postponed. In the 50s, a beginning was made by Solow. It was further developed in the 50s and the 60s, but work on the role of technical progress in economic development was postponed. In the Solow model, Solow recognizes the importance of technology, but he did not model it. But economic growth ultimately depends on technical progress. In the Solow model, technology is considered as exogenous. So, growth in the Solow model is exogenous. But later, in the early 1980s, two economists, that is Romer and Lucas, reignited interest in economic growth, emphasizing the role of ideas and human capital, reigniting the interest on growth by emphasizing the role of ideas and human capital, and taking advantage of the developments in the theory of imperfect competition. Romer introduced economics of technology, taking advantage of developments in the economics of imperfect competition. Romer introduced the role of technology as a major factor behind economic growth. All these were theoretical, and empirical work in this direction was done by Barrow. Empirical development, empirical analysis of the various growth models were done by Robert Barrow. That is, Barrow quantified and tested theories of economic growth. Both since then, there is enormous developments and literature analyzing the causes of economic growth and development. So, economic growth and development is actually an interplay between theory and observation. As it is an interplay between theory and observation, we first consider some of the observations which we observe in the real world. These are the facts of economic growth. That is, what we consider is some of the facts of economic growth, and whether the growth models initially introduced by Solow in the 1950s, later by Romer, Lucas, etc., can explain these facts of economic growth which we observe in the real world. And as you can see, the world consists of economies of all sizes and shapes. Some are rich, some are poor, some are growing rapidly, some are not growing at all. So there are various types of economies of different types, shapes, etc. There are rich economies, poor economies, middle income economies, economies growing at a fast rate, economies growing at a slow rate, economies not growing at all. So, a theory of economic growth is supposed to explain these empirical facts observed in the real world. Now, let us briefly explain what are these empirical facts which the growth theories are supposed to explain. The first one is there is enormous variation in per capita income. There is enormous variation in per capita income across countries. The poorest countries have per capita incomes that are less than 5% of the per capita incomes of rich countries. And if you go through the World Development Reports, you will see that there are very rich countries, middle income countries, or poor countries in terms of per capita income. So there are enormous variations in per capita income, and the per capita income of poor countries is only 5% of the per capita income of rich countries. I am not presenting the data here, you just refer the World Development Report published by United Nations year after year for comparing the countries of the world in terms of per capita incomes. Western countries are rich, some countries are middle income countries, some countries, especially in in the African continent, are poor. That is an empirical observation which a growth theory is supposed to explain. The second observation is growth rates differ. Growth rates differ substantially across countries. Growth rates differ substantially across countries. If you observe the growth rates of countries across the globe, you will observe that some countries are growing at a fast rate. Some countries are growing at very slow rates. Some countries also experience negative growth rates. Such countries are known as growth disasters. So, a growth theory is supposed to explain why growth rates are different. Robert Lucas, in his article on the mechanics of economic development suggested that a country growing at G% per year, a country growing at G% per year, double its per capita income by 70 by G years. 70 by G years. A country growing at 5%. For example, 70 by 5 per capita income double in 14 years. Then 2% in 35 years, 10% 7 years, like that. So growth rates are not uniform. Some countries are growing rapidly, some countries are growing slowly. This empirical fact is supposed to be explained by economic theory. The third empirical observation is growth rates are not constant. Growth rates are not constant. Are not constant. Means what we observe in the real world is economies experience rapid growth rate during some time period, but growth rate will decline after that. For example, in the post-Second World War period, Japan experienced rapid growth in the 50s and 60s, then growth rate declined. In the US economy, growth rate is very low, only 2% or something. In India, growth rate is very high after 1990s, and for the last 3 or 4 decades, China is experiencing rapid growth rate. Now the question is, why the countries experience rapid growth rates during some time periods and slow growth rates during other time periods? So the third empirical observation is growth rates vary substantially across countries. And this is the third empirical fact which a growth theory is supposed to explain. And a fourth one, which is the result of these two, second and third, is a country's relative position in the world distribution of per capita income is not immutable. Means countries can move from poor to rich or rich to poor. So its position in the world distribution of income is not immutable. Position change. For example, if a country is poor, but if it experiences rapid growth, it becomes a middle income country or rich country over time. Or if a country experiences slow growth rate, over time it may become poor from its position as a rich country. So these are the empirical facts observed in the real world. Actually, these are known as the stylized facts. Stylized facts introduced by Calder. So any growth theory is supposed to explain these stylized facts. That is, why there are variations in the level of per capita income between different countries, why growth rates are different among different countries, why growth rates are not constant between different countries of the world, and as a corollary to second and third, what happens to the relative position of a nation in the world distribution of income over time. And when we analyze Solow model of growth, we will consider all these empirical facts.